Welcome to the Sleep Detective, where we dive deep into the psychological mysteries that shape criminal minds. I'm your host, and tonight we're beginning a comprehensive analysis of one of America's most psychologically complex serial killers, Ted Bundy. Over the next 3 hours, we'll explore not just what he did, but why his mind worked the way it did, and how understanding his psychology can help us recognize similar patterns in modern cases. Before we dive deep into Bundy's psychology, I want you to become an active profiler. Based on what you'll learn in the first few minutes, put in the comments your prediction for this question. What do you think was Ted Bundy's actual IQ score? Don't look up the answer, use your psychological intuition from the patterns we'll explore. We'll reveal the answer in segment 7, and I'll read the best predictions from comments. Now, close your eyes and imagine you're the FBI profiler assigned to understand Theodore Robert Bundy. You're sitting in a quiet office, case files spread before you, trying to piece together how a seemingly normal child became one of America's most notorious killers. What you're about to discover will change how you see human psychology forever. Theodore Robert Bundy entered the world on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, but his very first breath was already tainted by psychological complexity. His mother, Louise Cowell, was just 22 years old and unmarried, a scandal that would create foundational trauma in his developing mind. The psychological impact of illegitimate birth in 1946 America wasn't just difficult. It was socially devastating and would fracture Ted's sense of self from the very beginning. Louise made a decision that would psychologically damage Ted for life. She would pretend to be his sister, while his grandmother would raise him as her own son. This wasn't just a family secret. It was psychological identity theft that taught Ted his first lesson in manipulation. Imagine being a child whose entire sense of self is built on a lie, learning that truth was fluid, that identity could be constructed, and that the people closest to you could deceive you completely. The household dynamics were even more psychologically damaging. Samuel Cowell, Ted's grandfather, was described as a volatile, potentially violent man who kept pornographic materials and had explosive anger outbursts. Ted's developing brain was absorbing these early patterns of male behavior, dominance through fear, sexual objectification, and emotional unpredictability. His earliest memories were forming in an environment where normal family structure was completely inverted. When Ted was around 4 years old, Louise finally revealed she was his mother, not his sister, and moved him across the country to Washington State. For a 4-year-old mind, this wasn't just change, it was complete identity demolition and reconstruction. Ted's mind was learning that reality itself could be changed at will, and this psychological lesson would become the foundation for his later ability to manipulate and deceive. The introduction of Johnny Bundy, who adopted Ted and gave him his name, brought stability but couldn't heal the psychological damage already done. Ted's capacity for genuine emotional attachment had been damaged in those crucial early years. He could perform the role of a loving son, but genuine emotional connection was psychologically impossible. His brain had learned that relationships were based on deception and that identity was fluid. By age 8, Ted had developed what psychologists call advanced social mimicry, the ability to read people's emotions and reflect back what they wanted to see. This wasn't empathy, it was psychological camouflage. The frequent family moves during his childhood became laboratories where Ted could practice being different versions of himself, unconsciously developing the skills that would later make him so effective at manipulation. Ted's academic performance was above average, but his psychological development was exceptional in disturbing ways. He was learning to read social situations with extraordinary accuracy, to present himself as harmless and likable, and to compartmentalize his inner thoughts from his outer presentation. By age 12, he was already showing signs of what forensic psychologists call predatory social analysis, studying classmates and teachers to learn their weaknesses and fears. The psychological foundation forming in Ted's adolescent mind was like a house built on quicksand. His charm, intelligence, and social skills were all constructed on a foundation of identity confusion, emotional damage, and defensive manipulation. His teenage years appeared normal on the surface, but psychological analysis reveals that all of this was performance. His real emotional development had been stunted by early trauma. Ted's relationship with his mother Louise remained complex throughout his childhood. She had created the original deception, and psychologically, Ted could never fully trust her. He was learning that even love could be based on lies. The psychological development pattern we see in Ted's childhood: early identity confusion, emotional neglect, compensatory manipulation skills, and social mimicry appears in many serial killers. But Ted's intelligence made his psychological damage nearly invisible. By his late teens, Ted had developed what psychologists call functional psychopathy. He could function normally in society and even excel, but his capacity for genuine emotional connection and moral reasoning had been severely compromised. His high school years showed him perfecting his psychological camouflage, popular with teachers and well-liked by classmates, while underneath, his psychological development was taking a much darker turn. The psychological trajectory from Ted's traumatic childhood to his eventual criminal behavior wasn't inevitable, but it was highly predictable. His early experiences had created a perfect storm of psychological factors: narcissistic injury, identity confusion, advanced manipulation skills, and an inability to form genuine emotional connections. What made Ted's childhood damage particularly dangerous was how his exceptional intelligence allowed him to adapt to trauma in sophisticated ways. Ted's psychological development was creating what forensic psychologists call compartmentalized identity with manipulative presentation. He was learning to be multiple people: the charming student, the loving son, the popular classmate, while his true self remained hidden and increasingly disturbed. The family dynamics that shaped his psychology weren't obviously abusive in ways that would have triggered intervention. They were subtly damaging and nearly invisible to outside observers. By the time Ted reached his early 20s, his psychological foundation was complete. He had learned to see relationships as games to be won, people as objects to be manipulated, and reality as something that could be constructed through charm and deception. His childhood trauma had created a psychological predator disguised as a charming young man, and his exceptional intelligence had allowed him to hide this damage behind a facade of normalcy that was nearly impenetrable. The psychological analysis reveals that Ted's later criminal behavior wasn't the result of sudden mental illness or personality change. It was the logical continuation of patterns developing since his earliest years. His mind had been unconsciously training for predatory behavior, and by his early 20s, he had developed what experts call high-functioning psychopathy with narcissistic traits: someone who could function excellently in society while being fundamentally unable to form genuine emotional connections. Ted's childhood psychological development created what experts call predatory adaptation with social camouflage. His mind was learning to identify potential victims, to approach them in ways that seemed safe and appealing, and to manipulate situations to his advantage. The psychological foundation laid in his childhood: identity confusion, emotional damage, advanced manipulation skills, and compartmentalization abilities would allow him to become one of America's most successful serial killers. What makes Ted's childhood psychologically fascinating is how normal it appeared on the surface. His psychological damage was subtle, complex, and nearly invisible, which made it far more dangerous than obvious trauma would have been. His relationship with authority figures taught him to charm teachers and impress adults, skills that would later allow him to manipulate victims, investigators, and even his own defense attorneys. Ted's personality by his late teens was characterized by what psychologists call adaptive narcissism with manipulative presentation. His early identity confusion and emotional damage had created an inflated sense of self-importance and an extraordinary ability to manipulate others. He was psychologically equipped to charm and deceive virtually anyone, having learned to weaponize his intelligence and social skills in service of his damaged psyche. The psychological foundation forming in Ted's mind was like a sophisticated weapon being assembled piece by piece. His childhood trauma had created what forensic experts call predatory social intelligence, the ability to read people's emotions, desires, and vulnerabilities with extraordinary accuracy. This wasn't empathy, it was psychological hunting skills. And he was learning to identify and exploit human weaknesses with devastating effectiveness. Ted's exceptional academic performance wasn't just intelligence, it was psychological camouflage. He was learning to excel in socially acceptable ways while hiding his growing psychological damage. His success in school was another tool in his developing arsenal of manipulation techniques. The psychological implications of his childhood trauma were creating what experts call evolutionary adaptation to predation. His mind was literally rewiring itself to prioritize manipulation and control over genuine human connection. By his early 20s, Ted's psychological development was complete. The confused, traumatized child had become a sophisticated psychological predator capable of functioning excellently in normal society while simultaneously possessing all the traits necessary for systematic manipulation and control. His mind had been shaped by decades of psychological development into something that could charm anyone while being fundamentally unable to see them as fully human. The psychological foundation we've explored: the identity confusion, emotional damage, advanced manipulation skills, and compartmentalization abilities created a mind that was perfectly equipped for predatory behavior. His early trauma had shaped him into someone who could present himself as trustworthy and appealing while being psychologically incapable of genuine emotional connection. This psychological development would soon begin manifesting in increasingly disturbing ways as he entered adulthood. Ted's childhood psychological development was creating what forensic experts call functional antisocial personality with high intelligence. He could function normally and even excel in many areas, but his psychological makeup was fundamentally predatory. He was learning to see other people as objects to be manipulated rather than individuals to be respected, and this worldview would become the foundation for everything that would follow. The psychological analysis of Ted's childhood reveals that his later criminal behavior was the logical result of psychological patterns that had been developing since his earliest years. His mind had been unconsciously preparing for predatory behavior, and by his early 20s, that preparation was complete. The foundation had been laid, the structure had been built, and the psychological weapon was ready to be deployed against an unsuspecting world. Ted's psychological foundation was now complete. What had begun as childhood trauma and identity confusion had been transformed through years of psychological adaptation into a sophisticated system for manipulation and control. His mind had learned to compartmentalize different aspects of his personality, to present himself as whatever others wanted to see, and to view other people as objects to be manipulated, rather than individuals with their own inherent worth. The psychological development we've analyzed created someone who was perfectly equipped for what would come next. Ted Bundy's mind was ready to begin the transition from psychological predator to something far more dangerous, a realization that would soon manifest in ways that would shock the world and forever change our understanding of how childhood trauma can shape a criminal mind. This psychological foundation would soon support the formation of his complete criminal personality, setting the stage for one of the most chilling cases in criminal psychology history. As Ted Bundy entered his 20s, The psychological foundation we explored was about to crystallize into something far more dangerous, a fully formed personality structure that would make him one of history's most effective predators. You're still the profiler, and now you're watching as all those childhood patterns begin to manifest in increasingly sophisticated ways. What you're about to witness is the birth of a criminal mind. Ted's enrollment at the University of Puget Sound in 1965 marked the beginning of what psychologists call personality consolidation under stress. College presented him with new challenges that would test and refine all the psychological adaptations he'd developed during childhood. The university environment was perfect for his developing personality structure, surrounded by intelligent, ambitious peers. He could practice his social mimicry skills on a more sophisticated level while conducting a complex social experiment. Ted's academic performance in college was solid but not exceptional, which frustrated him deeply. This frustration revealed the grandiose expectations that had been building since childhood. He believed he was superior to his peers, and when reality didn't match this belief, his psychological response was to blame external factors rather than examine his own limitations. His professors and classmates described him as charming and engaged, but he was actually learning how to be the perfect version of what each person wanted to see. During his sophomore year, Ted met Stephanie Brooks, a wealthy, sophisticated student who would become psychologically central to his personality development. Stephanie represented everything Ted felt he deserved but couldn't naturally attain: social status, wealth, and effortless confidence. His attraction to her wasn't love in any genuine sense. It was psychological obsession with what she represented, and his relationship with her became his first major attempt at long-term psychological manipulation of a specific target. Ted studied Stephanie's preferences, her social circle, her values, and systematically molded himself to match her ideal partner. This wasn't normal relationship adjustment, it was complete psychological reconstruction designed to achieve a specific outcome. He was conducting detailed psychological analysis of his target, learning her vulnerabilities and desires, then reshaping his entire persona to exploit that knowledge. This relationship became a laboratory for refining his manipulative abilities. Stephanie's eventual rejection of Ted in 1968 created what forensic psychologists call narcissistic rage with abandonment activation. She told him he was too immature, too directionless, too different from her social class. For someone whose entire psychological structure was built on the belief that he could manipulate anyone, this rejection wasn't just painful, it was psychologically devastating and would trigger a complete personality restructuring. The breakup triggered a psychological crisis that would reshape Ted's personality in fundamental ways. His carefully constructed self-image as irresistibly charming and superior to others had been shattered by someone he considered beneath his intelligence. Instead of self-reflection or emotional growth, he began what can only be described as a systematic campaign of self-improvement designed to make him psychologically invulnerable to future rejection. He was going to become the perfect predator. Ted's response to the rejection reveals the true nature of his psychological development. He transferred to the University of Washington, began working for political campaigns, and started law school, all calculated moves designed to build the kind of resume that would make him irresistible to someone like Stephanie. The months following the breakup saw him developing what psychologists call strategic perfectionism with manipulative intent. Ted's work on political campaigns during this period was psychologically revealing. He was drawn to politics not because of genuine ideological beliefs, but because it provided a perfect laboratory for studying human psychology and practicing manipulation on a larger scale. Campaign work taught him how to read crowds, how to present different messages to different audiences, and how to make people believe in things they hadn't previously considered. These skills were essentially training for serial predation. Ted's decision to attend law school wasn't driven by genuine interest in justice or legal advocacy. It was a strategic choice designed to build his psychological arsenal. Law school would teach him how to argue persuasively, how to manipulate evidence, and how to present himself as an authority figure. For someone with his psychological makeup, legal training was like weapons training, and he was learning to use his intelligence and charm not just socially, but professionally. During law school, Ted's personality structure was completing its formation into what forensic psychologists call functional psychopathy with professional camouflage. He was learning to use helping professions as camouflage for his true nature, and his work at a crisis counseling center was particularly significant. He was literally learning to identify psychological vulnerability in others while presenting himself as someone dedicated to helping them, gaining intimate access to the psychology of trauma and desperation. The psychological pattern that emerges from Ted's early 20s is what experts call predatory professional development. He wasn't just building a career, he was building a psychological hunting ground. Every skill he developed, every position he took, every relationship he formed was unconsciously serving his developing predatory psychology. His personality was characterized by what psychologists call compartmentalized excellence. He could be genuinely effective in professional roles while simultaneously developing tools for predation. The reunion with Stephanie Brooks in 1973 provided a perfect case study in Ted's personality development. He had transformed himself into exactly what she had wanted: successful, directed, professionally accomplished. When she agreed to resume their relationship, it proved to Ted that his psychological theories about manipulation were correct. He could become anyone he needed to be to get what he wanted, and this success would reinforce all his antisocial personality traits. Ted's treatment of Stephanie during their second relationship reveals the true nature of his personality formation. He was charming, attentive, and apparently devoted right up until the moment he had proven he could win her back. Then he abruptly ended the relationship, leaving her confused and hurt. This wasn't love or genuine attachment, it was psychological revenge and a test of his manipulative abilities. The experiment proved his personality development was successful. Ted's personality by his mid-20s was characterized by what forensic psychologists call adaptive antisocial functionality. He could function excellently in normal social and professional settings, while his psychological core remained fundamentally predatory. His work habits were methodical, detail-oriented, and exceptionally skilled at research and planning, traits that, combined with his predisposition toward manipulation, were creating the perfect skill set for systematic predation. The psychological development we see in Ted's early 20s shows how his personality was integrating all the skills and traits he had developed since childhood into a cohesive, functional whole. His charm, intelligence, manipulative abilities, and compartmentalization skills were all working together to create someone who could be extraordinarily effective at whatever he chose to focus on. Unfortunately, his psychological development was steering him toward increasingly predatory goals. Ted's social relationships during this period were characterized by what psychologists call instrumental friendships with surface authenticity. He could form relationships that appeared genuine and meaningful, but his true psychological motivation was always about what he could gain from the other person. He was incapable of genuine emotional reciprocity, and his romantic relationships followed a consistent pattern of identifying what women had that he wanted, then systematically working to gain psychological control over them. The personality structure Ted developed was like a sophisticated psychological machine designed for manipulation and control. Every interaction was filtered through the question of how he could use it to his advantage. This wasn't conscious evil, it was the logical result of his psychological development responding to adult challenges. His professional development was creating what forensic psychologists call authority-based manipulation skills through his work in politics, law, and crisis counseling. Ted's relationship with his family during this period reveals important aspects of his personality formation. He maintained the facade of being a loving son and brother while his true psychological development was taking him in increasingly antisocial directions. His ability to compartmentalize these different aspects of his personality was becoming extraordinarily sophisticated, and his academic and professional achievements were serving as both camouflage and skill development for his predatory nature. The personality structure that emerged from Ted's early 20s was characterized by what forensic psychologists call integrated antisocial functionality with professional competence. He had learned to use his intelligence, charm, and manipulative abilities not just for personal relationships, but for professional advancement and social positioning. His psychological development was creating what experts call systematic predatory preparation. Every skill served his developing antisocial personality structure. Ted's personality formation reveals that by 1974, he had developed all the psychological tools necessary for systematic predation. His charm could disarm victims. His intelligence could plan complex crimes, his manipulative abilities could control situations, and his professional competence could provide camouflage for his true nature. His personality was characterized by what psychologists call functional psychopathy. With integrated skill sets, he could function excellently in normal settings while possessing all the traits necessary for effective predation. The psychological foundation laid in childhood, refined during adolescence, and integrated during early adulthood, had created a personality structure that was perfectly equipped for what would come next. Ted's relationship patterns revealed the true nature of his personality formation. He was learning to identify psychological vulnerability, to present himself as exactly what others needed, and to maintain control through charm, manipulation, and emotional exploitation. Ted's work in crisis counseling was particularly revealing of his personality development. He was learning to identify and exploit psychological vulnerability while presenting himself as someone dedicated to helping others. This combination of predatory psychology with helping professional camouflage would make him extraordinarily effective at what he would do next. His personality had integrated all his childhood adaptations into a comprehensive system for identifying and exploiting victims. The personality structure that had formed by Ted's mid-20s was like a sophisticated psychological weapon system disguised as a charming, competent professional. His childhood trauma had been transformed into a tool for manipulation and control. His intelligence had been weaponized for predatory purposes, and his professional skills had been integrated into a system perfectly designed for systematic predation. The foundation had been laid, the structure had been built, and the weapon was ready to be deployed. Ted's psychological development during his early 20s reveals that his personality formation was complete. By 1974, he had integrated all his childhood adaptations, adolescent refinements, and early adult skills into a cohesive personality structure that was perfectly equipped for systematic predation. He possessed all the traits necessary for effective serial predation: charm to disarm victims, intelligence to plan crimes, manipulative abilities to control situations, and professional competence to provide camouflage. The psychological analysis of Ted's personality formation shows that by his mid-20s, he had become what forensic experts call a high-functioning predator with professional camouflage. His personality structure was complete, his skills were refined, and his psychological development was steering him toward increasingly dangerous applications of his abilities. His work in helping professions had given him intimate knowledge of human vulnerability that he was learning to exploit rather than heal. Ted's personality formation was now complete. The confused, traumatized child had become a sophisticated psychological predator capable of functioning excellently in normal society while simultaneously possessing all the traits necessary for systematic killing. His mind had been shaped by decades of psychological development into something that could charm anyone, manipulate any situation, and commit heinous crimes while maintaining a facade of normalcy and respectability. The psychological foundation from childhood, combined with the personality formation we've analyzed, had created someone who was perfectly equipped for what would happen next. Ted Bundy's mind was ready to begin the transition from psychological predator to actual killer, and this transformation would soon manifest in ways that would shock the world. His personality development had created the perfect tool for systematic predation, and that tool was about to be put to its intended use. Ted's personality by 1974 represented the culmination of nearly 3 decades of psychological development. Every childhood trauma, every adolescent adaptation, every early adult skill had been integrated into a personality structure that was perfectly designed for predatory behavior. His charm, intelligence, manipulative abilities, and professional competence had all been weaponized in service of a fundamentally antisocial psychology that saw other people as objects to be controlled and exploited. The psychological analysis reveals that Ted's personality formation was the logical result of his childhood experiences being refined and integrated through years of adult development. His mind had been unconsciously preparing for predatory behavior since his earliest years, and by his mid-20s, that preparation was complete. The personality structure we've explored would soon support the development of his criminal methodology, transforming him from a psychological predator into something far more dangerous and deadly. You're still the profiler. And now we're entering the most psychologically disturbing phase of Ted Bundy's development. The foundation has been laid, the personality structure is complete, and something dark is beginning to stir in the depths of his mind. What you're about to explore is the moment when psychological predation begins its transformation into something far more sinister, the birth of violent fantasy and the first stirrings of murderous impulse. The year 1974 marked a crucial psychological turning point for Ted Bundy. At 27, he had achieved everything he thought he wanted. He was succeeding in law school, working in crisis counseling, and had proven his ability to manipulate even someone like Stephanie Brooks. But psychological analysis reveals that this success wasn't bringing him the satisfaction he expected. Instead, it was creating what forensic psychologists call achievement emptiness with escalating needs, the realization that manipulation alone wasn't enough to satisfy his damaged psychology. His mind was craving something more intense, more complete, more final than simple psychological control. The successful manipulation of Stephanie had proven his theories about human psychology, but it hadn't filled the psychological void created by his childhood trauma. Ted's work at the Seattle Crisis Clinic during this period provides crucial insight into his psychological development. He was spending hours each day listening to people in their most vulnerable moments: rape victims, abuse survivors, people contemplating suicide. Most counselors would develop deeper empathy from this work, but Ted's damaged psychology was learning something entirely different. He was cataloging human vulnerability, studying the psychology of trauma, and unconsciously developing a predator's understanding of how to identify and exploit the most damaged victims. His professional training was being perverted into advanced victim selection education. Every call was teaching him how to recognize and exploit human weakness, creating a detailed psychological profile of vulnerability that he would later use for predatory purposes. The psychological pattern that emerges from Ted's crisis counseling work is what experts call empathy inversion with predatory learning. Instead of developing compassion for suffering, he was learning to recognize suffering as opportunity. His damaged psychology was transforming what should have been healing work into advanced victim selection training. He was learning to identify the psychological markers of vulnerability, the speech patterns of trauma, and the behavioral cues of isolation and desperation. Every conversation with a crisis caller was teaching him about human psychology at its most vulnerable state. His professional knowledge was being weaponized by his damaged psyche, creating a sophisticated understanding of how to identify and exploit psychological weakness. Ted's law school studies during this period were also serving his developing dark psychology in ways that wouldn't become clear until later. His coursework in criminal law wasn't just academic, it was research into how crimes are detected, how evidence is processed, and how legal systems work to catch criminals. His psychology was unconsciously absorbing information about how to avoid detection, how to manipulate evidence, and how to present himself as someone who could never be capable of violence. Every case study was becoming a lesson in criminal methodology. His legal education was providing him with sophisticated knowledge about investigative procedures, evidence collection, and prosecutorial strategies. The psychological analysis of Ted's daily routine in 1974 reveals the first signs of what experts call fantasy escalation with reality testing. He was spending increasing amounts of time alone, and psychological profiling suggests this solitude was being used to develop and refine violent fantasies. His work with vulnerable people was providing raw material for these fantasies. His imagination was becoming increasingly detailed and specific, focusing on scenarios where he could have complete control over another person. The psychological pressure was building as his fantasies became more elaborate and realistic. His mind was no longer content with imaginary control, it was beginning to crave the experience of actual control over life and death. Ted's relationship patterns during this period show subtle but significant changes that indicate his psychological development was entering a dangerous new phase. His romantic relationships were becoming more controlling and manipulative, with partners later describing feeling like they were being studied rather than loved. He was practicing psychological control techniques, refining his ability to dominate and manipulate, and testing the boundaries of what he could make people accept without arousing suspicion. His relationships were becoming laboratories for predatory skill development. Every interaction was teaching him more about human psychology and how to exploit it for his own purposes. The psychological development we see in Ted during early 1974 is what forensic psychologists call predatory fantasy consolidation. His mind was no longer content with simple manipulation and control, it was craving something more intense, more complete, more final. His psychology was beginning to explore the idea that the ultimate form of control over another person would be the power of life and death. His fantasies were becoming increasingly violent and detailed, incorporating specific scenarios, locations, and victim types. His damaged psyche was no longer satisfied with emotional manipulation, it was craving the ultimate manipulation of life itself. The psychological foundation laid in childhood was now supporting increasingly sophisticated and dangerous fantasy development. Ted's behavioral patterns during this period reveal what experts call stalking behavior development. He was beginning to spend time in locations where he could observe potential victims without being noticed: university campuses, parks, shopping centers. His psychology was learning to identify women who displayed the vulnerability markers he had learned to recognize through his crisis counseling work. He was unconsciously developing the skills of a predator, preparing for his first hunt, studying potential targets and learning their routines and vulnerabilities. His surveillance activities were becoming more systematic and focused as he learned to identify optimal hunting grounds and vulnerable individuals. The psychological transformation occurring in Ted's mind during this period was like a switch being slowly turned from psychological predation to physical predation. His fantasies were becoming more elaborate and specific, focusing on scenarios where he could have complete control over another person. The psychological pressure was building toward an inevitable breaking point where fantasy would need to become reality. Ted's choice of potential victims during this fantasy development phase reveals crucial psychological insights. He was attracted to young women who resembled Stephanie Brooks' long, dark hair, parted in the middle, intelligent, college-educated, from good families. This wasn't coincidence. It was psychological revenge fantasy being refined into actionable plans. His mind was transforming his deepest psychological wounds into a template for predatory behavior, turning his most painful rejection into a blueprint for systematic violence. Every potential victim was a substitute for Stephanie, representing both his desire for her and his rage at being rejected by her. The psychological analysis of Ted's developing fantasies reveals what experts call control escalation with dehumanization progression. His mind was learning to see potential victims not as individual human beings with their own lives and feelings, but as objects that could be used to satisfy his psychological needs. This dehumanization process was essential for his psychology to make the transition from fantasy to reality. He was systematically stripping away the humanity of potential victims in his mind, making actual violence psychologically possible. The empathy that should have prevented violence was being systematically dismantled by his damaged psychology. Ted's daily routines during this period show the psychological preparation for what would come next. He was developing what forensic psychologists call ritual behavior patterns, specific routes he would drive, specific locations he would visit, specific times he would engage in surveillance activities. His psychology was creating a framework for systematic predation. These routines were becoming rehearsals for actual predatory behavior, allowing him to practice and refine his approach without committing to actual violence. His mind was systematically preparing for the transition from fantasy to reality, creating behavioral patterns that could support systematic predation. The psychological development we see in Ted's mind during this period is what experts call fantasy-reality convergence. His elaborate mental scenarios were becoming more detailed and specific, incorporating real locations, real victim types, and real methodologies. His psychology was no longer content with imagination, it was preparing to make fantasy into reality. The psychological pressure was building toward an inevitable breaking point where fantasy would no longer be sufficient to satisfy his psychological needs. His mind was systematically preparing for the transition from imaginary control to actual control, from psychological predation to physical predation, from fantasy violence to actual murder. You're still the profiler. And now we're examining the crucial environmental factors that transformed Ted Bundy from a fantasy-obsessed predator into an active serial killer. The psychological foundation was set, the personality was formed, the dark impulses were developed. But something in his environment had to trigger the final transformation from thought to action. What you're about to discover is how external circumstances combined with internal psychology to create the perfect storm for serial murder. The Pacific Northwest in the early 1970s provided what forensic psychologists call optimal predatory environment for someone with Ted's psychological profile. The region's liberal, trusting culture meant that young women felt safe hitchhiking, walking alone at night, and helping strangers who appeared to need assistance. The geographic isolation of college campuses and the dense forests surrounding Seattle created numerous opportunities for crimes to occur without witnesses. Ted's psychology was perfectly adapted to exploit this trusting environment, and the cultural openness of the era made his predatory approach not only possible but highly effective. The Pacific Northwest's emphasis on community, cooperation, and helping others created ideal conditions for someone who could convincingly present himself as needing assistance. Ted's living situation during this period was psychologically significant in enabling his transition to violence. He was living alone in a small apartment on 12th Avenue Northeast in Seattle, which provided the privacy necessary for fantasy development and predatory planning. This isolation allowed his damaged psychology to develop without the moderating influence of close relationships or constant social interaction. His solitude was becoming a laboratory for refining his violent fantasies and preparing for their implementation, free from the reality checks that regular human contact might have provided. The psychological echo chamber of his isolated existence was amplifying his violent thoughts and making them seem more reasonable and justified. The University of Washington campus environment during this period was particularly conducive to Ted's predatory psychology. The campus culture of the early 1970s emphasized openness, trust, and social connection values that made potential victims more vulnerable to his manipulation. Young women were encouraged to be helpful, trusting, and socially engaged. The academic environment provided both hunting grounds and psychological camouflage for his predatory activities. The campus culture of intellectual discourse and social consciousness created optimal conditions for Ted's charm-based predatory approach, as his education and articulate presentation made him appear trustworthy and safe. Ted's work schedule during this period created what forensic psychologists call optimal predatory timing patterns. His part-time status at the crisis clinic and flexible law school schedule meant he had significant amounts of unstructured time during daylight hours, when potential victims were most active. His psychology was learning to recognize and exploit these temporal opportunities for surveillance and approach. Unlike someone with a traditional 9-to-5 job, Ted's schedule provided the flexibility necessary for systematic predation, allowing him to observe potential victims and identify optimal moments for approach. This temporal freedom was crucial for his ability to conduct surveillance and plan attacks without arousing suspicion. The social and cultural environment of 1972 Seattle was characterized by what experts call predatory opportunity maximization. The women's liberation movement had encouraged young women to be more independent and confident, but society hadn't yet developed awareness of serial predators like Ted. This created a perfect storm where potential victims were more accessible and less cautious. The cultural emphasis on trust and social connection made young women more likely to help strangers, creating optimal conditions for Ted's predatory approach. The lack of public awareness about serial predators meant that potential victims had no framework for recognizing and avoiding someone like Ted. Ted's access to a reliable vehicle during this period was crucial for his psychological transition from fantasy to reality. His tan Volkswagen Beetle became what forensic psychologists call predatory mobility enablement. It allowed him to travel between hunting grounds, transport victims, and dispose of evidence. The psychological significance of having mobile freedom cannot be overstated in understanding how his fantasies became actionable plans. The vehicle also served as a mobile command center where he could store his predatory toolkit and conduct surveillance activities without attracting attention. The Beetle's innocent, non-threatening appearance made it perfect for approaching potential victims without arousing suspicion. The geographic environment of the Pacific Northwest provided what experts call optimal disposal opportunities for someone with Ted's psychological profile. The region's dense forests, remote mountainous areas, and numerous waterways created countless locations where evidence could be concealed or destroyed. Ted's psychology was unconsciously cataloging these environmental resources and incorporating them into his predatory planning. His knowledge of the local geography, gained through outdoor activities and political work, was being transformed into tactical advantage for systematic predation. Every hiking trail, every remote parking area, every secluded location was being evaluated for its potential use in predatory activities. The psychological impact of Ted's romantic relationship with Elizabeth Klopfer during this period created what experts call emotional anchor with predatory disinhibition. Having a stable relationship provided psychological cover for his increasingly deviant behavior while also creating frustration that his psychology channeled into violent fantasy. The relationship gave him an alibi and a facade of normalcy. Elizabeth's presence in his life actually enabled his predatory behavior by providing the psychological stability and social cover necessary for systematic killing. The relationship allowed him to maintain his public persona while privately developing his predatory capabilities. Ted's exposure to detailed crime scene information through his law school studies was providing what forensic psychologists call forensic knowledge with predatory application. His coursework was teaching him how crimes are investigated, how evidence is collected, and how perpetrators are caught. His psychology was unconsciously using this information to refine his predatory planning and develop techniques for avoiding detection. Every case study was becoming a lesson in criminal methodology, and his legal education was serving as advanced training in evidence avoidance and investigative evasion. His professors were unknowingly providing him with a graduate-level education in criminal methodology. The media environment of the early 1970s created what experts call predatory education through crime reporting. Ted was exposed to detailed coverage of other serial crimes, learning from the mistakes of other predators and incorporating successful techniques into his own psychological planning. His intelligence allowed him to analyze crime reports as educational material rather than cautionary tales. The media's detailed coverage of criminal cases was inadvertently providing him with a comprehensive education in predatory methodology and investigative countermeasures. Every news report about unsolved crimes was teaching him what worked and what didn't in criminal activity. Ted's work at the crisis clinic was providing what forensic psychologists call victim psychology education with predatory application. His daily exposure to trauma victims was teaching him how people respond to violence, how they can be controlled through fear, and how they might attempt to escape or seek help. His psychology was transforming this professional knowledge into predatory intelligence. Every counseling session was becoming a lesson in human vulnerability and control techniques. His understanding of trauma psychology was being weaponized by his damaged psyche, creating sophisticated knowledge about how to identify and exploit psychological weakness. The psychological pressure created by Ted's academic and professional success was generating what experts call achievement paradox with escalation needs. His external success was creating internal expectations that normal accomplishments couldn't satisfy. His psychology was craving experiences that would match his inflated self-image, and conventional achievements were no longer providing the psychological gratification his damaged ego required. The disconnect between his public success and internal emptiness was creating pressure for increasingly extreme forms of psychological satisfaction. His need for control and dominance was escalating beyond what normal success could provide. The environmental factors we've explored were creating what experts call perfect predatory conditions for someone with Ted's psychological profile. The trusting culture, the geographic opportunities, the social access, the temporal flexibility, and the jurisdictional advantages all combined to create an environment where his violent fantasies could be transformed into reality with minimal risk of detection. The Pacific Northwest in the early 1970s was providing optimal conditions for systematic predation, and Ted's psychology was perfectly adapted to exploit these environmental advantages. The combination of internal psychological preparation and external environmental opportunity was creating the perfect storm for the emergence of a serial killer. You're still the profiler. And now we're entering the most chilling phase of our analysis, the moment when Ted Bundy's psychological development, environmental opportunities, and violent fantasies converged into systematic methodology. What you're about to explore is how a damaged mind transformed theoretical predation into practical killing techniques. This is the birth of a serial killer's modus operandi. Ted's first known attack on January 4, 1974, against Karen Sparks in her basement apartment, represented what forensic psychologists call methodology testing with escalation preparation. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was a carefully planned experiment in his developing killing methodology. Ted's psychology was testing his ability to enter a dwelling undetected, control a victim through violence, and escape without leaving evidence. The attack served as psychological proof that his fantasies could become reality. Karen survived, but the impact on Ted was profound. He had successfully transitioned from imagination to actual violence, proving he could commit crimes and avoid detection. This successful test gave him the confidence to escalate to more sophisticated attacks, creating a powerful psychological feedback loop. The psychological satisfaction of transitioning from fantasy to reality was intoxicating for his damaged psyche, validating years of planning and preparation. Ted had proven to himself that he could cross the line from imagination to action, fundamentally changing his psychological relationship with violence. He was no longer just a fantasist, he was now a proven predator, capable of making his darkest thoughts into reality. Ted's approach methodology reveals what experts call charm-based victim acquisition with vulnerability exploitation. His crisis counseling work had taught him to identify psychological vulnerability markers, allowing him to present himself as exactly what potential victims needed: helpful, trustworthy, and harmless. His methodology was based on exploiting the basic human instinct to help someone who appeared to need assistance. Ted had learned to weaponize human compassion, turning society's most positive traits into tools for predation. The psychological sophistication of this approach cannot be overstated. Ted was essentially hijacking the social programming that makes civilized society possible, using people's kindness and empathy as weapons against them. He had identified and learned to exploit the very qualities that make humans most admirable. Ted's development of the injured person technique was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that demonstrated his understanding of human psychology at its most fundamental level. By appearing to have a broken arm or leg, he could accomplish several predatory objectives simultaneously. He appeared harmless and non-threatening, created a legitimate reason to ask for help, and positioned himself as someone who couldn't possibly be dangerous. The fake cast or crutches served as psychological camouflage, making him appear vulnerable when he was actually the predator preparing to strike. This technique was devastatingly effective because it exploited people's natural desire to help those who appeared disabled or injured. The genius of this approach was that it reversed the normal predator-prey dynamic in the victim's mind. Instead of seeing Ted as a potential threat, victims saw him as someone who needed their protection and assistance, turning their compassion into vulnerability. This psychological reversal was so complete that victims would feel good about helping him, making them complicit in their own victimization while believing they were performing a charitable act. The manipulation was both sophisticated and deeply disturbing. Ted's victim selection methodology reveals what experts call systematic targeting with predictable outcome optimization. He wasn't randomly selecting victims, he was choosing women who displayed specific psychological and physical characteristics that made successful predation most likely. His methodology was designed to maximize chances of successful victim acquisition while minimizing risk of detection or resistance. Ted had developed a comprehensive victim profile that included physical appearance matching his psychological template, emotional vulnerability that could be exploited, social isolation that reduced discovery risk, and behavioral patterns that created optimal approach opportunities. The psychological analysis shows Ted was essentially conducting market research for murder, identifying the most vulnerable targets who would be least likely to resist effectively. Ted's approach locations were carefully chosen based on what experts call environmental psychology with predatory advantage. He selected areas where potential victims would be alone but not isolated enough to arouse suspicion if he was seen talking to them. University campuses, shopping areas, and parks provided the perfect balance of accessibility and deniability for his predatory approach. His methodology incorporated sophisticated environmental factors to create optimal conditions for victim acquisition, showing a deep understanding of how setting influences human behavior and decision-making. Ted understood that location was crucial to successful predation. He needed places where victims would feel safe enough to trust him, but isolated enough for successful predation without witnesses. Ted's conversation techniques reveal what experts call rapport establishment with trust exploitation. His law school training had taught him to be persuasive and authoritative, while his crisis counseling work taught him to quickly establish emotional connections with vulnerable people. His methodology combined these professional skills to create conversations that felt natural and safe to victims while serving his predatory purposes. The psychological analysis shows that Ted was essentially conducting microtherapy sessions on his victims, using professional counseling techniques to identify their emotional needs and then presenting himself as someone who could meet those needs. He could establish trust and rapport within minutes, making victims comfortable enough to accompany him to secondary locations where he could complete his attacks without interruption. Ted's development of the authority figure approach was psychologically brilliant in its simplicity and effectiveness. By presenting himself as a police officer, security guard, or other authority figure, he could approach victims without arousing suspicion and direct their behavior through perceived legitimate authority. His methodology exploited deep-seated psychological responses to authority that most people develop from childhood. The authority approach was particularly effective because it allowed Ted to give direct commands to victims while maintaining the illusion that he was helping them. Victims would comply with requests that should have aroused suspicion because they believed the orders came from legitimate law enforcement. This technique weaponized society's conditioning to respect and obey authority figures, turning civic responsibility into vulnerability. Ted's vehicle-based methodology reveals what experts call mobile predatory platform with escape optimization. His Volkswagen Beetle wasn't just transportation, it was a carefully designed component of his killing methodology that appeared harmless and non-threatening. The Beetle's innocent appearance was crucial to Ted's methodology. It looked like a college student's car, not something a dangerous predator would use. The vehicle served multiple practical functions in his predatory system. It provided a private space for initial victim control, offered mobility for transporting victims to secondary locations, and contained his predatory toolkit without attracting attention. The psychological analysis shows that Ted understood the importance of using a vehicle that would lower victims' guard while providing tactical advantages necessary for successful predation. Ted's methodology for controlling victims once in his vehicle demonstrates what forensic psychologists call graduated control escalation with psychological dominance. He would begin with verbal commands and apparent reasonableness, gradually escalating to physical restraint and violence as victims realize their danger. His methodology was designed to maintain psychological control while minimizing the risk of victims escaping or attracting attention. Ted had learned to manage the transition from trust to control in ways that prevented effective resistance or calls for help. The psychological sophistication of this approach shows that Ted understood the importance of managing the transition from public trust to private control, using a combination of authority, deception, and gradually increasing physical control to maintain victim compliance during critical moments. Ted's weapon selection reveals what experts call practical lethality with evidence minimization. His preference for blunt instruments like crowbars and clubs reflected his methodology's emphasis on quick, quiet kills that wouldn't leave ballistic evidence or require special procurement. Ted's weapon choices were also psychologically practical. Blunt instruments allowed him to maintain the personal control his damaged psychology craved. The selection of simple, common tools also meant that Ted could acquire and dispose of weapons easily without creating suspicious purchase records or requiring specialized knowledge to use effectively. His methodology prioritized practical considerations over any particular killing ritual, showing that his approach to murder was systematic and goal-oriented rather than driven by specific violent fantasies. Ted's development of secondary location methodology was crucial for his predatory success. He identified remote areas where he could complete his attacks without risk of interruption or discovery, carefully chosen based on what forensic psychologists call disposal convenience with detection avoidance. These locations were strategically selected to provide privacy for violence while offering opportunities for evidence disposal. Ted's evidence destruction methodology reveals what experts call forensic awareness with systematic elimination. His legal education had taught him how evidence is collected and analyzed, and his methodology incorporated this knowledge to minimize his forensic footprint. He was destroying or concealing evidence with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood exactly how investigations worked. Ted's methodology by 1975 represented what forensic psychologists call optimized predatory efficiency with systematic scalability. He had developed techniques that could be repeated indefinitely with minimal risk of detection or failure. His methodology was no longer experimental, it was a proven system that could support sustained predatory activity across multiple jurisdictions and extended time periods, making him extraordinarily dangerous. You're still the profiler, and now we're entering perhaps the most psychologically revealing aspect of Ted Bundy's criminal behavior, his systematic approach to victim selection. What you're about to explore isn't random violence, but a carefully orchestrated psychological process that reveals the deepest workings of a predatory mind. Understanding how Ted selected his victims provides crucial insight into both his damaged psychology and the vulnerability patterns that serial killers exploit. Ted's victim selection process was governed by what forensic psychologists call composite fantasy fulfillment with psychological revenge integration. His choice of victims wasn't arbitrary, it was deeply connected to his psychological wounds, particularly his traumatic rejection by Stephanie Brooks. The physical resemblance between his victims and Stephanie reveals that Ted was essentially killing the same woman over and over again, acting out his rage and need for control against a specific psychological target. The psychological analysis of Ted's victim demographics reveals what experts call systematic vulnerability exploitation with predictable pattern recognition. His victims were overwhelmingly young women aged 15-25, college students or recent graduates, from middle-class backgrounds, with long dark hair parted in the middle. This wasn't coincidence, it was psychological programming that connected his deepest emotional wounds to his predatory targeting system. Ted's ability to identify psychological vulnerability in potential victims was enhanced by his crisis counseling experience, which had taught him what forensic psychologists call trauma recognition with predatory application. He could spot women who were emotionally vulnerable, socially isolated, or dealing with personal crises. His professional training in recognizing human suffering had been perverted into a tool for identifying the most vulnerable targets for his predatory behavior. The psychological sophistication of Ted's victim approach methodology reveals what experts call empathy simulation with trust exploitation. He would study potential victims before approaching them, learning their routines, their interests, and their social connections. This reconnaissance allowed him to present himself as exactly the type of person each victim would find trustworthy and appealing, making his approach seem natural and non-threatening. Ted's selection of victims from university environments was psychologically significant beyond mere opportunity. College campuses provided what forensic psychologists call optimal victim psychology with environmental advantage. University women were typically intelligent, independent, and confident, qualities that made them attractive to Ted's psychological need to dominate and control someone he perceived as valuable. The challenge of controlling intelligent victims provided greater psychological satisfaction. The psychological analysis of Ted's timing and victim selection reveals what experts call vulnerability window identification with exploitation optimization. He would observe potential victims to identify moments when they were most vulnerable, walking alone at night, dealing with personal problems, or separated from their support networks. His psychology had developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize and exploit these moments of maximum vulnerability. Ted's rejection of certain potential victims provides crucial insight into his psychological selection criteria. He would abandon approaches if victims seemed too suspicious, too confident, or too likely to resist effectively. His psychology was conducting what forensic psychologists call risk-benefit analysis with success probability assessment. He was choosing victims who provided maximum psychological satisfaction with minimum risk of failure or detection. The psychological significance of Ted's victim age preferences reveals what experts call developmental fixation with power fantasy integration. His preference for victims in their late teens and early 20s wasn't just about physical attractiveness, it was about psychological vulnerability. Women in this age group were often experiencing independence for the first time, making them more likely to trust strangers and less likely to recognize dangerous situations. Ted's ability to identify victims who were emotionally isolated was enhanced by his understanding of what forensic psychologists call social network analysis with vulnerability detection. He could recognize women who were new to an area, recently ended relationships, or dealing with family problems. His psychology had learned to identify social isolation as a key vulnerability factor that would make victims less likely to be quickly missed if they disappeared. The psychological analysis of Ted's victim selection process reveals what experts call fantasy projection with reality matching. His victims had to fit not just physical criteria, but psychological ones. They had to embody the qualities that his damaged psychology needed to control and destroy. His selection process was matching real women to the psychological template created by his early trauma and ongoing fantasy development. Ted's approach to victims in pairs or groups demonstrates what forensic psychologists call social dynamics exploitation with isolation strategy. He would sometimes approach women who were with friends, using his charm to gain the trust of the group before isolating his actual target. His psychology understood that women were more likely to trust someone who had been accepted by their friends, and he exploited this social dynamic for predatory purposes. The psychological sophistication of Ted's victim personality assessment reveals what experts call character analysis with manipulation optimization. He could quickly evaluate a woman's personality traits, identifying those who were naturally helpful, trusting, or eager to please. His psychology had developed an almost instant ability to recognize personality types that would be most susceptible to his manipulation techniques. Ted's selection of victims from helping professions or volunteer activities was psychologically revealing. He specifically targeted women who worked in social services, education, or volunteer organizations because their helpful nature made them more likely to assist someone who appeared to need help. His psychology was exploiting the very compassion and social consciousness that made these women valuable members of society. The psychological analysis of Ted's victim stalking behavior reveals what experts call pattern recognition with predictive modeling. He would observe potential victims over extended periods, learning their routines, their habits, and their decision-making patterns. His psychology was developing detailed profiles of victim behavior that allowed him to predict their actions and identify optimal moments for approach. Ted's ability to adapt his approach based on victim psychology demonstrates what forensic psychologists call personality mirroring with strategic presentation. He would modify his appearance, his speech patterns, and his behavior to match what each victim would find most appealing and trustworthy. His psychology could become whatever each victim needed him to be, making his predatory approach nearly irresistible. The psychological significance of Ted's victim selection across different geographic areas reveals what experts call hunting ground diversification with pattern concealment. By selecting victims from different universities, cities, and states, he was not only avoiding detection, but also satisfying his psychological need for variety and challenge. His psychology required increasingly sophisticated victim selection to maintain his interest and engagement. Ted's preference for victims with specific educational backgrounds was psychologically significant. He was drawn to women studying psychology, sociology, and liberal arts fields that attracted compassionate, socially conscious individuals. His psychology was specifically targeting women whose educational background made them more likely to trust and help someone who appeared to need assistance. The psychological analysis of Ted's victim rejection criteria reveals what experts call predatory selectivity with success optimization. He would abandon potential victims who seemed too streetwise, too suspicious, or too likely to resist effectively. His psychology was conducting sophisticated risk assessments that prioritized his safety and success over any particular victim, demonstrating the calculated nature of his predatory behavior. Ted's ability to identify victims who were experiencing personal crises was enhanced by his crisis counseling training. He could recognize signs of depression, anxiety, relationship problems, or family issues that made women more psychologically vulnerable. His psychology had learned to identify emotional distress as an opportunity for predatory exploitation, perverting his professional training into a tool for victim selection. The psychological sophistication of Ted's victim approach timing reveals what experts call emotional state exploitation with vulnerability maximization. He would approach victims when they were tired, stressed, or emotionally distracted, recognizing that these states made them less likely to be cautious or suspicious. His psychology understood that emotional vulnerability created optimal conditions for successful predatory approach. Ted's selection of victims based on their social isolation patterns demonstrates what forensic psychologists call support network analysis with exploitation strategy. He could identify women who were new to an area, had recently moved, or were socially isolated for other reasons. His psychology recognized that isolated victims were less likely to be quickly missed and more likely to trust a friendly stranger. The psychological analysis of Ted's victim selection evolution reveals what experts call preference refinement with experience optimization. Over time, his victim selection became more sophisticated and specific, reflecting his growing experience and confidence. His psychology was learning from each encounter, refining his understanding of what made potential victims most vulnerable and most suitable for his predatory purposes. Ted's ability to identify victims who matched his psychological needs was enhanced by his understanding of what forensic psychologists call trauma projection with symbolic targeting. His victims weren't just random women, they were specific representations of his psychological wounds and needs. His psychology was selecting victims who embodied the qualities he needed to control and destroy in order to satisfy his damaged psyche. Ted's victim selection methodology by 1975 represented what forensic psychologists call perfected predatory targeting with systematic efficiency. He had developed a comprehensive system for identifying, evaluating, and selecting victims who would provide maximum psychological satisfaction while presenting minimum risk of detection or resistance. His psychology had created a sophisticated targeting system that could identify suitable victims quickly and accurately, making him extraordinarily dangerous. You're still the profiler. And now we're entering the most psychologically intense phase of Ted Bundy's criminal career, his peak psychological state during 1974 to 1975. This is when all his psychological development, methodological refinement, and predatory experience converged into what forensic psychologists call optimal predatory functioning. Before we dive into his peak psychological state, let's address the prediction challenge from our first segment. You were asked to predict Ted Bundy's actual IQ score based on the psychological patterns we've explored. The answer, revealed through psychological testing conducted during his trials, was 124 above average, but not genius level. This score is psychologically significant because it shows that Ted's effectiveness came not from exceptional intelligence, but from the sophisticated integration of above-average intelligence with his damaged psychology and predatory skills. His success was about psychological development, not raw intellectual capacity. Ted's psychological state during his peak killing period was characterized by what forensic psychologists call integrated predatory confidence with systematic optimization. By 1975, he had successfully killed multiple victims without detection, refined his methodology through experience, and developed absolute confidence in his ability to identify, approach, and control victims. The psychological analysis of Ted's mental state during this period reveals what experts call compartmentalized excellence with emotional detachment. He was simultaneously functioning as a successful law student, crisis counselor, and political volunteer while planning and executing murders with systematic efficiency. His psychology had achieved perfect compartmentalization. He could switch between his public persona and his predatory self without internal conflict or external detection. This ability to maintain multiple identities simultaneously made him extraordinarily dangerous and nearly impossible to detect. Ted's peak psychological state was characterized by what forensic psychologists call grandiose self-concept with reality-based confidence. His success in avoiding detection while committing multiple murders had reinforced his belief in his own superiority and invulnerability. His psychology had developed what experts call predatory narcissism, an inflated sense of self-worth based on his ability to control and kill other human beings without consequence. This psychological inflation was both driving his continued violence and protecting him from guilt or remorse. The psychological sophistication of Ted's mental state during this period is revealed through what experts call emotional regulation with predatory functionality. He had developed the ability to experience normal emotions in his personal and professional relationships while simultaneously maintaining the emotional detachment necessary for systematic killing. Ted's peak psychological state included what forensic psychologists call risk calibration with success optimization. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to assess and manage risk in his predatory activities. His psychology could evaluate potential victims, approach situations, and environmental factors with remarkable accuracy. The psychological analysis of Ted's mental state reveals what experts call fantasy-reality integration with satisfaction optimization. His violent fantasies and his actual crimes had become perfectly synchronized, with each feeding the other in a continuous cycle of psychological gratification. Ted's peak psychological state was characterized by what forensic psychologists call social manipulation mastery with predatory application. His ability to charm, deceive, and manipulate people had reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. His psychology could read social situations, identify individual vulnerabilities, and adapt his presentation to achieve specific outcomes. The psychological sophistication of Ted's mental state during this period is revealed through what experts call operational security with professional integration. He had developed systematic approaches to maintaining his cover, managing evidence, and avoiding detection that rivaled professional intelligence operatives. Ted's peak psychological state included what forensic psychologists call victim psychology mastery with exploitation optimization. His understanding of human psychology, enhanced by his crisis counseling experience, had reached the level where he could predict and manipulate victim behavior with extraordinary accuracy. The psychological analysis of Ted's mental state reveals what experts call stress tolerance with performance optimization. Unlike many serial killers who deteriorate under the stress of their crimes, Ted's psychology actually improved with each successful attack. His mental state was characterized by increased confidence and refined methodology. Ted's peak psychological state was characterized by what forensic psychologists call emotional compartmentalization with functional integration. He could experience genuine affection for Elizabeth Klopfer while simultaneously planning to kill strangers who resembled her. His psychology had developed the ability to maintain authentic emotional connections while pursuing predatory behavior. The psychological sophistication of Ted's mental state during this period is revealed through what experts call investigative awareness with countermeasure implementation. His legal education and political experience had given him sophisticated understanding of how law enforcement worked, and his psychology was using this knowledge to actively evade detection. Ted's peak psychological state included what forensic psychologists call territorial expansion with systematic exploitation. His confidence had reached the point where he was expanding his hunting grounds across multiple states, each requiring different approaches and presenting different challenges. The psychological analysis of Ted's mental state reveals what experts call professional competence with predatory integration. His success in his legitimate activities, law school, crisis counseling, political work was actually enhancing his predatory capabilities. His psychology had learned to use professional skills as tools for predatory behavior. Ted's peak psychological state was characterized by what forensic psychologists call pattern recognition with adaptive methodology. His experience had taught him to recognize law enforcement patterns, media coverage cycles, and public attention spans. His psychology was adapting his predatory behavior to exploit these patterns. The psychological sophistication of Ted's mental state during this period is revealed through what experts call victim impact assessment with satisfaction optimization. He had developed the ability to predict how different types of victims would respond to his approaches and how their disappearances would be investigated. Ted's peak psychological state included what forensic psychologists call emotional simulation with authentic presentation. His ability to simulate normal emotions and relationships had reached the point where even people close to him couldn't detect his predatory nature. The psychological analysis of Ted's mental state reveals what experts call systematic learning with continuous improvement. Each crime was providing psychological feedback that refined his methodology and enhanced his capabilities. His psychology was treating predatory behavior as a skill to be perfected. Ted's peak psychological state was characterized by what forensic psychologists call confidence escalation with risk tolerance expansion. His success in avoiding detection had created a psychological feedback loop where each successful crime increased his confidence and willingness to take greater risks. Ted's peak psychological state by 1975 represented what forensic psychologists call perfect predatory integration with societal camouflage. His psychology had successfully integrated all aspects of his development into a comprehensive system for systematic predation that was virtually undetectable to those around him, making him one of the most dangerous. You're still the profiler. And now we're examining one of the most psychologically sophisticated aspects of Ted Bundy's criminal behavior, the control mechanisms he developed to maintain his double life while committing systematic murder. What you're about to explore reveals how a serial killer can function normally in society while pursuing predatory behavior, demonstrating the terrifying efficiency of compartmentalized evil. Ted's control mechanisms were built on what forensic psychologists call psychological compartmentalization with operational security. He had developed the ability to maintain completely separate mental and emotional states for his public persona and his predatory activities. This wasn't simple role-playing, it was a sophisticated psychological architecture that allowed him to be genuinely effective in both domains. The foundation of Ted's control system was what experts call identity segregation with authentic performance. During his public activities, law school, crisis counseling, political work, he wasn't acting or pretending to be normal. His psychology could genuinely access the emotions, motivations, and behaviors necessary to excel in these roles while completely suppressing his predatory nature. Ted's work schedule provided what forensic psychologists call temporal compartmentalization with activity laundering. His flexible schedule allowed him to commit crimes during times when his absence wouldn't be noticed, while his legitimate activities provided alibis and explanations for his whereabouts. His psychology had learned to use normal life activities as cover for predatory behavior. The psychological sophistication of Ted's control mechanisms is revealed through what experts call emotional authenticity with selective suppression. He could experience genuine emotions, love for Elizabeth Klopfer, satisfaction from academic success, enjoyment of social activities while completely shutting down empathy and moral reasoning when committing violence. Ted's relationship management demonstrates what forensic psychologists call attachment simulation with predatory protection. His romantic relationship with Elizabeth served multiple control functions. It provided psychological stability, social credibility, and emotional camouflage for his true nature. The relationship was both genuine and strategically useful for his predatory activities. The control mechanisms Ted employed in his professional life reveal what experts call competence authenticity with skill weaponization. His success as a crisis counselor wasn't fake, he was genuinely effective at helping people in crisis. However, his psychology was simultaneously using these interactions to study human vulnerability and refine his predatory techniques. Ted's social control mechanisms were based on what forensic psychologists call charm deployment with strategic relationship management. He could form apparently genuine friendships and professional relationships that served his psychological needs while providing social cover for his activities. His charm wasn't entirely calculated. His psychology could access genuine social emotions when they served his purposes. The psychological analysis of Ted's stress management reveals what experts call cognitive dissociation with performance maintenance. The stress of leading a double life and committing murders should have degraded his performance in legitimate activities, but Ted's psychology had developed mechanisms to prevent this interference. His academic and professional performance remained consistently high. Ted's evidence management demonstrates what forensic psychologists call forensic consciousness with systematic elimination. His legal education had taught him about evidence collection and analysis, and his control mechanisms included comprehensive procedures for eliminating physical traces of his crimes. He approached evidence destruction with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to his legitimate work. The control mechanisms Ted used for geographical management reveal what experts call territorial segmentation with jurisdictional exploitation. He committed crimes across multiple states and jurisdictions, making detection more difficult while providing himself with multiple bases of operation. His psychology understood how to exploit the limitations of 1972nd law enforcement coordination. Ted's timing control mechanisms demonstrate what forensic psychologists call temporal optimization with pattern disruption. He varied the timing of his attacks to avoid establishing predictable patterns while exploiting optimal conditions for predatory success. His psychology could recognize and exploit temporal vulnerabilities in both victim behavior and law enforcement response. The psychological sophistication of Ted's emotional control is revealed through what experts call effective regulation with compartmentalized expression. He could express appropriate emotions in social and professional settings while maintaining complete emotional detachment during violent acts. This emotional flexibility made him extraordinarily effective in both domains of his life. Ted's communication control mechanisms were based on what forensic psychologists call narrative consistency with strategic revelation. He maintained consistent stories about his activities and whereabouts while strategically revealing personal information that enhanced his credibility and trustworthiness. His psychology understood how to use selective honesty as a tool for deception. The control mechanisms Ted employed for managing suspicion reveal what experts call deflection strategies with credibility enhancement. When questioned about his activities or whereabouts, he could provide plausible explanations while redirecting attention away from his predatory behavior. His psychology was skilled at making suspicion seem unreasonable or unfounded. Ted's physical control mechanisms demonstrate what forensic psychologists call appearance management with persona optimization. He could modify his appearance, clothing, and physical presentation to match the requirements of different situations. His psychology understood how physical presentation influences perception and used this knowledge strategically. The psychological analysis of Ted's memory management reveals what experts call selective retention with strategic amnesia. He could remember details crucial to his legitimate activities while seeming to forget or minimize information related to his crimes. This wasn't necessarily conscious deception. His psychology may have developed mechanisms to protect his public persona from contamination by his predatory activities. Ted's crisis management mechanisms were based on what forensic psychologists call adaptive response with damage control. When faced with unexpected challenges or close calls, his psychology could quickly adapt his behavior and explanations to minimize risk while maintaining his cover. His ability to think quickly under pressure made him extraordinarily difficult to catch. The control mechanisms Ted used for managing his relationship with Elizabeth reveal what experts call intimate deception with genuine attachment. He could maintain a loving relationship while concealing his true nature, demonstrating that his psychology was capable of compartmentalizing even his most intimate connections. This made his deception particularly sophisticated and difficult to detect. Ted's professional control mechanisms demonstrate what forensic psychologists call competence maintenance with skill integration. His success in law school and crisis counseling wasn't separate from his criminal activities. His psychology had learned to integrate professional skills into his predatory toolkit while maintaining excellence in both domains. The psychological sophistication of Ted's long-term planning reveals what experts call strategic projection with contingency preparation. He maintained plans and preparations for various scenarios while continuing his predatory activities. His psychology was capable of both immediate tactical thinking and long-term strategic planning. Ted's social network control mechanisms were based on what forensic psychologists call relationship cultivation with strategic positioning. He maintained friendships and professional relationships that provided social credibility while offering potential alibis and character references. His psychology understood the value of social capital in maintaining his cover. The control mechanisms Ted employed for managing his public image reveal what experts call reputation management with credibility cultivation. He actively worked to establish himself as trustworthy, competent, and socially valuable, creating a public persona that made accusations of criminal behavior seem implausible. Ted's psychological control mechanisms during this period represent what forensic psychologists call integrated deception with authentic functionality. He had developed a system of control that allowed him to be genuinely effective in legitimate activities while pursuing systematic predation. This integration made him extraordinarily dangerous because his public competence provided perfect camouflage for his criminal nature. The control mechanisms we've explored reveal that Ted's ability to maintain his double life wasn't based on simple deception or acting. It was a sophisticated psychological architecture that allowed him to function authentically in multiple domains while concealing his true nature. This level of psychological control made him one of the most dangerous predators in criminal history, capable of systematic killing while maintaining the trust and respect of those around him. You're still the profiler. And now we're examining the psychological forces that drove Ted Bundy's escalation from controlled predation to increasingly desperate and reckless behavior. What you're about to explore is how even the most sophisticated criminal mind eventually succumbs to internal pressure and external circumstances. This is the anatomy of a serial killer's psychological unraveling. Ted's escalation during 1975 to 1976 was driven by what forensic psychologists call tolerance development with satisfaction inflation. Like an addiction, his psychological need for the gratification provided by killing was requiring increasingly frequent and intense experiences. His early methodical approach was giving way to more impulsive and risky behavior as his psychological hunger grew. The psychological pressure building within Ted's mind was characterized by what experts call fantasy saturation with reality insufficiency. His violent fantasies had become so elaborate and detailed that reality could no longer match their psychological intensity. This created a feedback loop where each actual killing felt less satisfying than his imagination, driving him to seek more extreme experiences. Ted's geographical expansion during this period reveals what forensic psychologists call territorial compulsion with risk escalation. His psychological need for new challenges and hunting grounds was driving him to operate in unfamiliar areas where he lacked his usual environmental advantages. This expansion was both a symptom of his escalating needs and a source of increased vulnerability to detection. The psychological analysis of Ted's behavioral changes shows what experts call control degradation with impulse acceleration. The careful planning and methodical approach that had characterized his early crimes was deteriorating as his psychological pressure increased. He was making decisions more quickly, taking greater risks, and showing less concern for evidence management and operational security. Ted's frequency escalation during this period was driven by what forensic psychologists call psychological tolerance with compulsive repetition. The psychological relief and satisfaction he gained from killing was lasting for shorter periods, requiring more frequent attacks to maintain his psychological equilibrium. His predatory behavior was becoming compulsive rather than purely strategic. The pressure points that were building in Ted's personal life reveal what experts call compartmentalization stress with integration failure. Maintaining his double life was becoming psychologically exhausting as the gap between his public persona and private reality widened. The cognitive and emotional energy required to maintain his deception was reaching unsustainable levels. Ted's relationship with Elizabeth Klopfer was showing signs of what forensic psychologists call intimate proximity pressure with exposure risk. Living closely with someone who cared about him was creating psychological stress as he struggled to maintain his deception. Elizabeth's growing suspicions and questions were forcing Ted to expend increasing energy on relationship management and damage control. The psychological pressure from Ted's academic and professional obligations was creating what experts call performance maintenance burden with attention division. His success in law school and crisis counseling was requiring significant psychological resources. At the same time, his criminal activities were becoming more demanding. This dual pressure was unsustainable and contributing to his deteriorating control. Ted's psychological state during this period was characterized by what forensic psychologists call grandiosity inflation with reality distortion. His early success in avoiding detection had created an inflated sense of his own capabilities and invulnerability. This psychological inflation was leading him to take risks that his earlier, more cautious self would have avoided. The escalation in Ted's victim selection reveals what experts call opportunity exploitation with criteria relaxation. The specific victim profile he had previously maintained was becoming less rigid as his psychological pressure increased. He was becoming more opportunistic and less selective, targeting victims who were available rather than optimal for his psychological needs. Ted's technological and methodological changes during this period show what forensic psychologists call efficiency prioritization with security degradation. His methods were becoming more direct and brutal as his psychological need for immediate gratification overcame his earlier emphasis on careful planning and evidence management. He was prioritizing speed and efficiency over safety and concealment. The psychological pressure building from media attention reveals what experts call publicity stress with operational interference. Increased media coverage of disappearances in his hunting areas was creating pressure that affected his psychological state and operational planning. The attention was both gratifying to his narcissistic needs and threatening to his operational security. Ted's response to law enforcement pressure demonstrates what forensic psychologists call authority challenge compulsion with risk magnification. Rather than retreating in response to increased police activity, his psychology was driving him to continue operating in dangerous areas. His need to prove his superiority over law enforcement was overriding his survival instincts. The escalation in Ted's post-crime behavior reveals what experts call trophy escalation with risk accumulation. His psychological need to collect and retain mementos from his crimes was increasing, leading him to take greater risks in acquiring and storing evidence that could link him to his victims. This behavior was both psychologically necessary and operationally dangerous. Ted's sleep and stress patterns during this period show what forensic psychologists call physiological degradation with psychological compensation. The stress of maintaining his double life while escalating his criminal activity was taking a physical toll that his psychology was struggling to manage. His body was showing signs of stress that his mind was trying to suppress. The psychological pressure from Ted's financial situation reveals what experts call resource stress with operational constraint. His student lifestyle and part-time income were creating practical limitations on his ability to travel and operate across multiple states. Financial pressure was forcing him to make operational compromises that increased his vulnerability. Ted's social behavior during this period was characterized by what forensic psychologists call isolation tendency with support system erosion. The psychological energy required to maintain his deception was causing him to withdraw from some social relationships. This isolation was both protecting his secrets and depriving him of the social support that helped maintain his psychological stability. The escalation in Ted's fantasy life reveals what experts call imagination intensification with reality dissociation. His violent fantasies were becoming more elaborate and consuming more of his psychological energy. The line between fantasy and reality was becoming increasingly blurred as his psychological pressure mounted. Ted's decision-making during this period shows what forensic psychologists call cognitive deterioration with judgment impairment. The psychological stress of his escalating activities was affecting his ability to make rational decisions about risk and safety. His earlier careful analysis was being replaced by more impulsive and emotional decision-making. The pressure from Ted's academic obligations was creating what experts call performance anxiety with identity threat. His success in law school was crucial to his self-image and future plans, but the psychological energy required for his criminal activities was threatening his academic performance. This created additional stress that further destabilized his psychological state. Ted's response to relationship pressure reveals what forensic psychologists call intimacy avoidance with emotional numbing. The psychological energy required to maintain deception in close relationships was becoming overwhelming. He was becoming emotionally distant and less responsive to the people who cared about him most. The escalation in Ted's risk-taking behavior during this period was driven by what experts call thrill addiction with danger normalization. His psychological need for excitement and stimulation was requiring increasingly dangerous activities. Behaviors that should have triggered alarm were becoming normalized as his psychological baseline shifted. Ted's psychological state by late 1975 was characterized by what forensic psychologists call system overload with control degradation. The multiple pressures from his escalating criminal activity, personal relationships, academic obligations, and operational security were exceeding his psychological capacity to manage. His sophisticated control mechanisms were beginning to fail. The escalation and pressure points we've explored reveal that even the most psychologically sophisticated serial killers eventually succumb to the internal and external pressures created by their criminal behavior. Ted's escalation during this period was setting the stage for the mistakes and exposure that would eventually lead to his capture, demonstrating that no criminal, regardless of intelligence or psychological sophistication, can indefinitely maintain the complex deceptions required for systematic predation. You're still the profiler. And now we're examining one of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of Ted Bundy's criminal career, his mental state during the investigation that would eventually lead to his capture. What you're about to explore is the psychology of a serial killer under pressure, revealing how even the most sophisticated criminal mind responds when the net begins to close. Ted's psychological response to the developing investigation was characterized by what forensic psychologists call detection awareness with adaptive countermeasures. By late 1975, he was becoming increasingly aware that law enforcement was connecting disappearances across multiple jurisdictions. His psychology responded not with retreat or panic, but with calculated adaptation of his methods and increased operational security. The psychological analysis of Ted's behavior during this period reveals what experts call investigative pressure response with performance optimization. Rather than deteriorating under the stress of potential discovery, Ted's psychology actually sharpened his focus and enhanced his criminal performance. The pressure was creating a heightened state of psychological arousal that improved his predatory capabilities. Ted's relationship with media coverage demonstrates what forensic psychologists call publicity monitoring with narcissistic gratification. He was following news reports about the investigations with intense interest, deriving psychological satisfaction from the attention his crimes were receiving. The media coverage was feeding his grandiose self-image while providing valuable intelligence about investigative progress. The psychological sophistication of Ted's intelligence gathering reveals what experts call counter-surveillance with information exploitation. His legal education and political connections gave him access to information about investigative procedures and progress. His psychology was using this knowledge to stay ahead of law enforcement while adapting his methods to exploit investigative limitations. Ted's response to witness descriptions and composite sketches shows what forensic psychologists call identification threat management with appearance modification. When sketches began circulating that resembled him, his psychology responded with systematic changes to his appearance and behavior. He was capable of objective self-assessment and strategic adaptation to reduce his vulnerability. The psychological analysis of Ted's geographical decision-making during this period reveals what experts call territorial abandonment with expansion strategy. As pressure increased in his primary hunting areas, his psychology drove him to expand into new territories rather than cease his activities. His need for continued predation was overriding safety considerations. Ted's communication behavior during the investigation demonstrates what forensic psychologists call information control with selective engagement. He was carefully managing what information he shared with friends, family, and authorities while gathering intelligence about investigative progress. His psychology understood the importance of controlling information flow while appearing cooperative and helpful. The psychological pressure of living under investigation was creating what experts call hypervigilance with performance anxiety. Ted was constantly monitoring his environment for signs of surveillance or suspicion while trying to maintain his normal activities and relationships. This psychological state required enormous energy and was beginning to affect his decision-making capabilities. Ted's response to direct questioning by investigators reveals what forensic psychologists call authority interaction with deception management. When contacted by police, his psychology could deploy sophisticated deception techniques while maintaining an appearance of helpfulness and cooperation. His legal training provided him with knowledge of how to interact with law enforcement without incriminating himself. The psychological analysis of Ted's alibi construction shows what experts call timeline management with credibility enhancement. He was systematically developing explanations for his whereabouts during relevant time periods while ensuring these alibis were consistent and verifiable. His psychology understood the importance of proactive reputation management. Ted's behavior toward potential witnesses demonstrates what forensic psychologists call exposure risk assessment with mitigation strategy. He was identifying people who might have information that could link him to his crimes and developing strategies to manage these relationships. His psychology was capable of long-term strategic thinking, even under pressure. The psychological sophistication of Ted's evidence management during this period reveals what experts call forensic consciousness with systematic elimination. His legal education had taught him about evidence collection and analysis, and his psychology was applying this knowledge to minimize his forensic footprint while investigations were active. Ted's response to increased law enforcement presence in his hunting areas shows what forensic psychologists call operational adaptation with tactical flexibility. Rather than abandoning his activities, his psychology was developing new methods and approaches that could succeed despite increased police attention. His adaptability made him extraordinarily difficult to catch. The psychological pressure of maintaining his double life while under investigation was creating what experts call compartmentalization stress with integration failure. The cognitive and emotional energy required to maintain his deception while adapting to investigative pressure was reaching unsustainable levels, but his psychology was still fighting to maintain control. Ted's relationship management during this period demonstrates what forensic psychologists call intimate deception with damage control. His interactions with Elizabeth Klopfer and other close relationships were becoming increasingly difficult as his stress levels rose and his behavior changed. His psychology was struggling to maintain the emotional authenticity necessary for close relationships. The psychological analysis of Ted's sleep and stress patterns during the investigation reveals what experts call physiological degradation with psychological compensation. The stress of living under potential investigation was taking a physical toll that his psychology was working to suppress. His body was showing signs of stress that contradicted his controlled exterior. Ted's response to investigative techniques demonstrates what forensic psychologists call methodology awareness with countermeasure development. His understanding of police procedures allowed him to anticipate investigative approaches and develop countermeasures. His psychology was treating the investigation as a chess game where he could anticipate and counter his opponent's moves. The psychological pressure from Ted's academic and professional obligations during this period was creating what experts call performance maintenance burden with attention division. His success in law school and other activities was requiring psychological resources at the same time he was managing investigative pressure. This dual burden was unsustainable and contributing to his deteriorating control. Ted's decision to relocate to Utah in August 1975 reveals what forensic psychologists call territorial escape with operational continuity. His psychology recognized that the Pacific Northwest was becoming too dangerous while still needing to continue his predatory activities. The relocation was both a strategic retreat and an expansion into new hunting grounds. The psychological analysis of Ted's behavior in Utah shows what experts call environmental adaptation with methodology refinement. His psychology was adapting his techniques to new geographical and social environments while learning from the investigative pressure he had experienced in Washington. He was becoming more sophisticated and careful. Ted's response to the developing multi-state investigation demonstrates what forensic psychologists call jurisdictional awareness with exploitation strategy. His understanding of law enforcement limitations across state boundaries was allowing him to exploit communication gaps and coordination problems. His psychology was using legal and procedural knowledge strategically. The psychological sophistication of Ted's long-term planning during this period reveals what experts call strategic projection with contingency preparation. Even while under investigative pressure, his psychology was maintaining plans for various scenarios, including potential arrest and prosecution. He was thinking several moves ahead while continuing his activities. Ted's interaction with other suspects and persons of interest shows what forensic psychologists call suspect community awareness with competitive analysis. He was monitoring how investigations were treating other potential suspects and learning from their successes and failures. His psychology was treating other suspects as both shields and sources of intelligence. The psychological state Ted maintained during the investigation period represents what forensic psychologists call pressure performance with adaptive resilience. His ability to function effectively under investigative pressure while continuing his criminal activities demonstrated extraordinary psychological resilience and adaptability. This capability made him far more dangerous than criminals who deteriorate under pressure. The investigation psychology we've explored reveals that Ted's response to law enforcement pressure was characterized by adaptation, intelligence gathering, and strategic thinking rather than panic or retreat. His ability to function effectively while under investigation demonstrated the sophisticated psychological architecture that made him one of the most dangerous and elusive serial killers in history, capable of operating successfully even when law enforcement was actively pursuing him. You're still the profiler. And now we're examining the psychological moment that every serial killer eventually faces the collapse of their carefully constructed world. What you're about to explore is how Ted Bundy's sophisticated control mechanisms finally failed, leading to his capture and the beginning of his psychological unraveling. This is the anatomy of a criminal mind under ultimate pressure. Ted's arrest on August 16, 1975, by Utah Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward represented what forensic psychologists call random intersection with systematic vulnerability. Despite all his planning and careful methodology, Ted was captured during a routine traffic stop when his suspicious behavior in a residential neighborhood aroused police attention. His psychology had not accounted for random law enforcement encounters outside his operational planning. The psychological analysis of Ted's behavior during the traffic stop reveals what experts call authority confrontation with deception failure. For the first time in his criminal career, Ted's usual charm and manipulation techniques failed to work effectively. Sergeant Hayward's suspicions were not dispelled by Ted's explanations, and his psychology was experiencing the unfamiliar stress of failed deception. Ted's response to the discovery of his burglary kit demonstrates what forensic psychologists call evidence exposure with rationalization attempt. When police found rope, handcuffs, ice pick, and other suspicious items in his vehicle, his psychology attempted to provide innocent explanations. However, The combination of items created a pattern that his usual explanations could not adequately explain away. The psychological impact of Ted's first arrest was characterized by what experts call control loss with systematic exposure. His carefully maintained double life was suddenly vulnerable to scrutiny in ways he had never experienced. The arrest created a paper trail and official record that would make future deception far more difficult and dangerous. Ted's behavior in custody during his initial arrest reveals what forensic psychologists call institutional adaptation with information management. His psychology quickly adapted to the jail environment while carefully controlling what information he provided to authorities. His legal training helped him understand his rights and tactical options during interrogation. The psychological analysis of Ted's response to being linked to the Carol Duranch kidnapping shows what experts call victim testimony threat with credibility challenge. When Duranch identified him in a lineup, Ted's psychology shifted to challenging her credibility and memory rather than maintaining innocence. His legal training guided his strategic response to eyewitness identification. Ted's decision to represent himself during legal proceedings demonstrates what forensic psychologists call narcissistic control assertion with competence display. His psychology could not tolerate having his fate controlled by others, even qualified attorneys. His need to maintain control and demonstrate his superiority overrode practical considerations about legal representation. The psychological sophistication of Ted's courtroom behavior reveals what experts call performance maintenance with audience manipulation. Even while facing serious charges, his psychology could deploy charm and manipulation techniques to influence judges, juries, and observers. His courtroom presence was designed to project innocence and competence. Ted's response to mounting evidence against him shows what forensic psychologists call denial escalation with reality distortion. As physical evidence and witness testimony accumulated, his psychology intensified its denial mechanisms. Rather than accepting responsibility, his ability to maintain his innocence narrative became increasingly detached from objective reality. The psychological analysis of Ted's escape from the Pitkin County Courthouse reveals what experts call opportunity exploitation with impulsive action. His legal training and courthouse familiarity allowed him to recognize and exploit a security weakness. However, the escape also demonstrated increasing desperation and willingness to take extreme risks. Ted's behavior during his brief period of freedom demonstrates what forensic psychologists call liberty desperation with operational degradation. His psychology was driven by immediate survival needs rather than careful planning. His usually sophisticated methodology was replaced by impulsive decision-making and increasing recklessness. The psychological impact of Ted's recapture shows what experts call control illusion collapse with reality confrontation. His brief escape had reinforced his belief in his own capabilities, making his recapture psychologically devastating. His psychology was forced to confront the reality that his situation was beyond his control. Ted's second escape from Glenwood Springs Jail reveals what forensic psychologists call systematic planning with infrastructure exploitation. His psychology had learned from his first escape, developing a more sophisticated plan that exploited weaknesses in jail construction and procedures. This escape demonstrated his continued ability to think strategically under pressure. The psychological analysis of Ted's time as a fugitive shows what experts call identity reconstruction with survival adaptation. His psychology attempted to create a new identity and life in Florida while his familiar support systems and resources were no longer available. This period revealed how dependent his success had been on his established infrastructure. Ted's final capture in Pensacola demonstrates what forensic psychologists call desperation exposure with method abandonment. His theft of the stolen Volkswagen that led to his final arrest showed how far his decision-making had deteriorated. His psychology was no longer capable of the careful planning that had characterized his earlier criminal success. The psychological impact of Ted's final arrest was characterized by what experts call system collapse with defense activation. His carefully constructed psychological defenses went into overdrive as he faced the reality of permanent captivity. His psychology began developing new narratives and strategies for this fundamentally different situation. Ted's response to being charged with the Chi Omega murders reveals what forensic psychologists call evidence overwhelming with narrative fragmentation. The physical evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis created a case that his usual denial strategies could not effectively counter. His psychology was struggling to maintain coherent alternative explanations. The psychological analysis of Ted's behavior during the Florida proceedings shows what experts call media exploitation with attention seeking. His psychology recognized that his trials were generating significant media attention and began playing to this audience. His need for attention and control found new expression through media manipulation. Ted's relationship with his defense team demonstrates what forensic psychologists call control resistance with self-sabotage. His psychology could not accept guidance or control from his attorneys, leading to strategic decisions that harmed his defense. His need to maintain control was more important than practical considerations about his survival. The psychological sophistication of Ted's manipulation of female admirers reveals what experts call charisma deployment with emotional exploitation. Even while on trial for murder, his psychology could attract and manipulate women who were drawn to his notoriety. This demonstrated that his fundamental manipulative abilities remained intact despite his circumstances. Ted's response to the death penalty demonstrates what forensic psychologists call mortality confrontation with denial persistence. Even when facing execution, his psychology maintained its denial mechanisms and grandiose self-concept. The reality of his mortality created cognitive dissonance that his damaged psychology could not effectively resolve. The psychological analysis of Ted's final confessions reveals what experts call legacy management with partial revelation. His decision to confess to multiple murders was motivated by his psychology's need to control his narrative and maintain relevance. Even his confessions were strategic rather than expressions of genuine remorse. Ted's behavior during his final years on death row shows what forensic psychologists call institutional adaptation with identity preservation. His psychology adapted to prison life while maintaining core aspects of his grandiose self-image. He continued to seek attention and control through interviews, correspondence, and legal appeals. The psychological analysis of Ted's execution demonstrates what experts call final control assertion with dramatic presentation. Even in his final moments, his psychology was concerned with how he would be perceived and remembered. His execution represented the ultimate failure of his lifelong need to control his environment and other people. The capture and breakdown we've explored reveal that even the most sophisticated criminal psychology eventually succumbs to the accumulated pressure of maintaining complex deceptions and the inevitable intersection of criminal behavior with law enforcement capabilities. Ted's psychological unraveling was not sudden, but gradual, as each arrest, escape, and recapture eroded his control mechanisms until his carefully constructed world finally collapsed completely, exposing the damaged psychology that had driven his criminal career. You're still the profiler, and now we're examining one of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of Ted Bundy's story, his interaction with the legal system that would ultimately decide his fate. What you're about to explore is how a criminal mind adapts to courtroom psychology, revealing the complex interplay between legal procedures and psychological manipulation. This is the psychology of a predator using his final hunting ground. Ted's approach to his legal proceedings was characterized by what forensic psychologists call courtroom predation with audience manipulation. He recognized that the courtroom provided him with a new type of hunting ground where he could deploy his charm and intelligence to manipulate judges, jurors, and the media. His psychology treated legal proceedings as another form of predatory activity. The psychological analysis of Ted's decision to represent himself reveals what experts call narcissistic control assertion with competence delusion. His psychology could not tolerate having his fate controlled by others, even qualified attorneys. His inflated self-concept convinced him that his intelligence and legal knowledge made him superior to professional defense counsel. Ted's behavior during jury selection demonstrates what forensic psychologists call psychological profiling with manipulation targeting. His crisis counseling experience had taught him to read people quickly and identify psychological vulnerabilities. He was using these skills to identify jurors who might be susceptible to his charm and manipulation techniques. The psychological sophistication of Ted's courtroom performance reveals what experts call theatrical presentation with emotional manipulation. He understood that legal proceedings are partly performance art, and his psychology was deploying theatrical techniques to create specific impressions. His handsome appearance, articulate speech, and apparent sincerity were weapons in his psychological arsenal. Ted's response to witness testimony shows what forensic psychologists call credibility challenge with reality distortion. Rather than addressing the substance of evidence against him, his psychology focused on undermining witness credibility and creating alternative narratives. His legal training provided him with techniques for challenging testimony without directly confronting damaging facts. The psychological analysis of Ted's interaction with female admirers during his trials reveals what experts call notoriety exploitation with emotional manipulation. His psychology recognized that his criminal notoriety was actually attracting certain women, and he systematically exploited these relationships for emotional support, practical assistance, and psychological gratification. Ted's marriage to Carolyn Boone during his trial demonstrates what forensic psychologists call legal manipulation with emotional exploitation. His psychology understood that a marriage would provide him with spousal privilege protections while also demonstrating to jurors that an intelligent woman believed in his innocence. The marriage was both genuine emotional connection and strategic legal maneuver. The psychological sophistication of Ted's media manipulation reveals what experts call publicity management with narrative control. He recognized that his trials were generating enormous media attention and began systematically managing his public image through interviews and statements. His psychology was treating media coverage as another jury that could be influenced. Ted's response to physical evidence demonstrates what forensic psychologists call scientific challenge with technical evasion. His legal education had taught him about evidence collection and forensic procedures, and his psychology was using this knowledge to challenge the admissibility and interpretation of physical evidence rather than explaining its presence. The psychological analysis of Ted's cross-examination techniques shows what experts call intimidation deployment with psychological pressure. When he had the opportunity to cross-examine witnesses, his psychology deployed subtle intimidation techniques designed to make them uncomfortable and potentially inconsistent in their testimony. Ted's behavior during his Florida trials reveals what forensic psychologists call desperation masking with performance intensification. As the evidence against him mounted and his situation became more desperate, his psychological response was to intensify his courtroom performance rather than accept reality. His charm and manipulation techniques became more pronounced as his situation became more hopeless. The psychological sophistication of Ted's legal arguments demonstrates what experts call technicality exploitation with procedural manipulation. His psychology focused on legal technicalities and procedural errors rather than substantive defenses, recognizing that cases could be won or lost on technical grounds regardless of actual guilt or innocence. Ted's response to victim impact testimony shows what forensic psychologists call emotional detachment with empathy simulation. When confronted with the human cost of his crimes, his psychology could simulate appropriate emotional responses while maintaining complete emotional detachment from his victim's suffering. This ability to fake empathy was both sophisticated and deeply disturbing. The psychological analysis of Ted's relationship with his legal team reveals what experts call control resistance with collaborative sabotage. His psychology could not accept guidance or strategic direction from his attorneys, leading to decisions that actively harmed his defense. His need for control was more important than his survival. Ted's behavior during sentencing demonstrates what forensic psychologists call authority challenge with defiance display. When faced with the death penalty, his psychology responded not with remorse or acceptance, but with continued defiance and challenge to the court's authority. His grandiose self-concept could not accept the reality of his situation. The psychological sophistication of Ted's appeals process reveals what experts call hope maintenance with strategic delay. His psychology used the appeals process not just to avoid execution, but to maintain psychological hope and continue his manipulation of the legal system. Each appeal was another opportunity to deploy his intelligence and charm. Ted's interaction with law enforcement during his confessions demonstrates what forensic psychologists call information control with legacy management. Even when confessing to murders, his psychology was carefully controlling what information he revealed and how he revealed it. His confessions were strategic rather than expressions of genuine remorse. The psychological analysis of Ted's behavior on death row shows what experts call institutional adaptation with identity preservation. His psychology adapted to prison life while maintaining core aspects of his grandiose self-image. He continued to seek attention and control through interviews, correspondence, and legal maneuvers. Ted's response to execution dates demonstrates what forensic psychologists call mortality denial with control assertion. Even when facing imminent execution, his psychology maintained its denial mechanisms and continued attempts to control his situation. His damaged psychology could not accept the reality of his powerlessness. The psychological sophistication of Ted's final interviews reveals what experts call posthumous manipulation with narrative construction. His psychology was concerned with how he would be remembered and studied after his death. Even his final statements were calculated to influence his legacy and maintain some measure of control over his narrative. Ted's behavior during his final appeals shows what forensic psychologists call desperation. Escalation with strategic abandonment. As his execution approached, his psychology began abandoning his usual sophisticated strategies in favor of increasingly desperate legal maneuvers. His usual careful planning was replaced by frantic attempts to delay the inevitable. The psychological analysis of Ted's final days reveals what experts call reality confrontation with defense collapse. As his execution date approached and all appeals were exhausted, his psychology was finally forced to confront the reality that his situation was beyond his control. This confrontation was psychologically devastating for someone whose entire identity was built on manipulation and control. Ted's execution on January 24, 1989, represents what forensic psychologists call ultimate control failure with identity dissolution. The moment of his execution was the final failure of his lifelong need to control his environment and other people. His psychology's fundamental premise that he could manipulate any situation to his advantage was definitively proven false. The legal system psychology we've explored reveals that Ted's interaction with the courts was characterized by the same predatory intelligence and manipulative sophistication that had defined his criminal career. His psychology treated the legal system as another environment to be exploited and controlled, demonstrating that even when facing ultimate consequences, his fundamental nature remained unchanged. Ted's journey through the legal system from arrest to execution represents the final chapter in the psychological development we've been analyzing. His psychology's inability to adapt to a situation where charm and manipulation could not ensure success ultimately led to his destruction, proving that even the most sophisticated criminal mind cannot indefinitely evade the consequences of its actions. You're still the profiler. And now we reach the final phase of our psychological journey through Ted Bundy's mind. What you're about to explore is perhaps the most important aspect of our analysis: how understanding his psychology can help us recognize, prevent, and protect against similar predators in the future. This is where psychological insight becomes practical protection. Ted Bundy's psychological legacy represents what forensic experts call criminal psychology education with prevention application. His case has become a foundational study in understanding how childhood trauma, personality development, and environmental factors can combine to create systematic predators. The psychological insights gained from his case have revolutionized our understanding of serial killer development and detection. The psychological analysis of Ted's development reveals what experts call warning sign identification with intervention opportunity. The patterns we've explored: early identity, confusion, emotional detachment, manipulation skills, and compartmentalization abilities provide a roadmap for recognizing similar psychological development in others before it reaches criminal expression. Ted's case demonstrates what forensic psychologists call intelligence weaponization with charm deployment. His above-average intelligence combined with sophisticated social skills made him extraordinarily dangerous because it allowed him to hide his predatory nature behind a facade of normalcy and competence. This combination teaches us that intelligence and charm can be weapons rather than virtues. The psychological sophistication of Ted's manipulation techniques reveals what experts call trust exploitation with vulnerability targeting. His ability to identify and exploit human kindness and compassion shows us how predators can weaponize our most positive social instincts. Understanding these techniques helps us recognize when helpfulness might be being exploited. Ted's victim selection patterns demonstrate what forensic psychologists call vulnerability recognition with predatory targeting. His systematic approach to identifying psychologically and socially vulnerable victims provides crucial insights into how predators choose their targets. This knowledge helps potential victims recognize and avoid dangerous situations. The psychological analysis of Ted's environmental exploitation shows what experts call opportunity recognition with systematic predation. His ability to identify and exploit environmental factors, trusting cultures, geographic isolation, jurisdictional boundaries, teaches us how predators adapt to and exploit their surroundings for criminal purposes. Ted's compartmentalization abilities reveal what forensic psychologists call identity segregation with authentic performance. His capacity to function normally in legitimate activities while pursuing predatory behavior demonstrates how dangerous individuals can hide in plain sight. This insight is crucial for recognizing that competence and respectability can coexist with criminal psychology. The psychological development we've traced from Ted's childhood to his execution demonstrates what experts call trajectory analysis with intervention identification. Understanding how psychological damage develops and manifests over time provides opportunities for recognition and intervention before criminal behavior begins. Ted's case illustrates what forensic psychologists call professional skill perversion with predatory application. His use of crisis counseling training, legal education, and political experience for criminal purposes shows how predators can weaponize helping professions and social institutions. This knowledge helps institutions develop better screening and monitoring procedures. The psychological analysis of Ted's relationship patterns reveals what experts call intimate deception with emotional exploitation. His ability to maintain apparently genuine relationships while concealing his true nature teaches us about the sophisticated deception capabilities of dangerous individuals and the importance of trusting intuitive concerns about partners. Ted's response to investigation and legal proceedings demonstrates what forensic psychologists call authority manipulation with system exploitation. His ability to exploit legal procedures, manipulate media coverage, and charm court personnel shows how dangerous individuals can use institutional processes for their own benefit rather than justice. The psychological sophistication of Ted's evidence management reveals what experts call forensic awareness with detection evasion. His systematic approach to avoiding detection teaches law enforcement about the capabilities of intelligent predators and the importance of comprehensive investigative techniques and interjurisdictional cooperation. Ted's case provides what forensic psychologists call behavioral pattern recognition with predictive application. The patterns of escalation, geographical expansion, and victim selection we've analyzed can help law enforcement recognize and predict similar criminal behavior in active cases. The psychological analysis of Ted's peak performance period demonstrates what experts call optimal predatory functioning with systematic efficiency. Understanding how dangerous individuals operate at their most effective helps us recognize the signs of systematic predation and develop countermeasures. Ted's escalation and pressure point development reveals what forensic psychologists call criminal psychology breakdown with detection opportunity. The psychological pressures that eventually led to his capture provide insights into how even sophisticated criminals eventually make mistakes that lead to their detection. The psychological impact of Ted's media manipulation shows what experts call publicity exploitation with narrative control. His ability to use media attention for his own purposes teaches us about the dangers of celebrity criminal culture and the importance of responsible crime reporting that doesn't glorify perpetrators. Ted's influence on subsequent criminal behavior demonstrates what forensic psychologists call copycat inspiration with methodology transmission. His case has unfortunately inspired other criminals, teaching us about the psychological impact of detailed crime coverage and the importance of focusing on prevention rather than criminal techniques. The psychological analysis of Ted's treatment by the justice system reveals what experts call institutional response with procedural adaptation. His case led to improvements in legal procedures, evidence handling, and interjurisdictional cooperation that have made the justice system more effective at handling similar cases. Ted's case illustrates what forensic psychologists call victim advocacy with survivor support. The courage of survivors like Carol Durant and the advocacy for victims' families have led to improved support systems and legal protections for those affected by violent crime. The psychological insights gained from Ted's case have contributed to what experts call risk assessment with prevention strategy. Modern psychological assessment tools and intervention programs have been developed based partly on understanding gained from analyzing cases like Ted's. Ted's case demonstrates what forensic psychologists call community protection with awareness education. Public education about predatory behavior patterns, manipulation techniques, and warning signs has been enhanced by understanding gained from his case, helping communities protect themselves more effectively. The psychological analysis of Ted's case contributes to what experts call criminal psychology research with academic advancement. His case continues to be studied in universities and research institutions, advancing our understanding of criminal psychology and improving training for law enforcement, mental health professionals, and legal personnel. Ted's legacy includes what forensic psychologists call prevention program development with early intervention. Understanding the childhood and adolescent factors that contributed to his development has led to programs designed to identify and help at-risk individuals before they develop criminal behavior patterns. The psychological journey we've completed through Ted Bundy's mind serves what experts call educational purpose with protective application. By understanding how his psychology developed, functioned, and ultimately failed, we gain crucial insights that can help protect society from similar predators and potentially prevent the development of such dangerous psychology in future individuals. Our analysis of Ted Bundy's psychology from childhood trauma to execution reveals that understanding criminal minds is not about fascination with evil, but about protection from it. The psychological patterns we've explored, the warning signs, the development stages, the operational methods, and the eventual breakdown provide a roadmap for recognition, prevention, and protection that can help ensure that the victims of Ted Bundy and others like him did not suffer in vain.